Now let's talk a little bit about the ethnic and religious diversity that you would find in the West at this time. So you had a number of Chinese immigrants in the West at the time, in California and other areas of the country. And Chinese immigrants first came to the United States as contracted workers. Okay, so they would sign a contract with a Chinese business back in China, and then that business would sign a contract with American companies to bring over these contracted workers to work on the railroads, for example. Chinese immigrants played a huge role in developing the railroads in California and in other areas as well as in working in various different factories and industrial areas like in San Francisco. And you also had some religious diversity in the West as well, right? Not just Protestants or Catholics like you would find in the East, but you also had Mormons, okay? So you had the Mormon sect traveling to Utah, to the Salt Lake Valley, and settling down there in the 1840s. And they pretty much governed the Utah territory in that region. But eventually there would be conflict, violent conflict between the United States government, settlers, and the Mormons in Utah. Okay, one example of this was the Mountain Meadows Massacre. All right, the Mountain Meadows Massacre, basically this involved a wagon train of settlers, right? This is in the 1850s. They're taking a wagon train through the Utah territory, and this wagon train is attacked by a Mormon militia. Now, why did this Mormon militia attack the wagon train? Well, there were federal troops who were occupying the Utah territory at that time because the federal government was having problems with the territorial governor, Brigham Young, okay, the territorial governor of Utah. So there was basically heightened tensions at this time, and that's why the Mormon militia decided to attack this wagon train. They thought there was a war coming with the United States. Also, you have the issue of polygamy, which caused Protestants in the United States to judge the Mormon religion because the Mormon religion was accepting of polygamy at the time. And polygamy is, if you don't know, is the ability of a man to marry more than one woman, okay, to have multiple wives. But eventually, the Mormon leadership would outlaw polygamy, and it would be written into the Utah Constitution. And this needed to be done in order for Utah to eventually gain statehood in the United States. All right, and then you got Native Americans, right? There's a huge amount of various different tribes living in this area that we're calling the West, right? You got the Great Plains area, you know, including like all the way up from North Dakota down to Texas, over to areas of parts of New Mexico, Colorado, up to Montana, right? This huge area known as the Great Plains. In this area, you have a number of different tribes. Many of the tribes in this area, the backbone of their economy is the buffalo. That's what they live off of. So it's very important that the buffalo herds not be disturbed. But you also have other tribes who were farmers in the area as well. But basically, you're going to have conflict rising as more and more settlers from the United States begin traveling through the Plains Indians territories, and conflict begins to arise. And eventually, many of the Plains tribes will be displaced by American settlers who are moving permanently onto their territory, right? Not just traveling through it, but actually moving to their territory, right? Eventually, though, you're going to see resistance. You're going to see various examples of resistance. We'll talk about one example, the Battle of Little Bighorn. Okay, the Battle of Little Bighorn takes place between the federal government and a couple of different tribes who were in an alliance together, right? And these tribes include the Lakota, also known as the Sioux, but their actual name is the Lakota, and the Cheyenne. Okay, so these are two different tribes. The Arapaho were also took part in the Battle of Little Bighorn as well. And so you had this alliance of tribes who came together and fought against the U.S. federal government under the leadership of George Custer, and they were victorious, right? They killed Custer, and 250 of his men, pretty much wiped out his whole regiment. And this whole battle was fought over the encroachment of the U.S. onto Native American land. Okay, basically, the U.S. wanted to bring miners into the Black Hills because gold had been discovered there. Well, the Black Hills are a sacred area to the Lakota. And so they did not want, miners and settlers and just, random people coming into their area and starting to mine for gold and basically desecrate that sacred space. Okay, so that's why the Battle of Little Bighorn erupted, and it was a major victory for the Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho Alliance. But eventually, the Plains tribes would be forced onto reservations. Part of the reason why they were forced on the reservations is because their traditional economy was undermined by the federal government, who hired a number of buffalo hunters to go out and just massively kill a large amount of buffalo. Right, millions of buffalo were just slaughtered and left there on the Great Plains, not even using it for food, not even using it for the hides in some cases. And so they're just laying there. And so this is going to wipe out the food source for a number of Plains tribes. Okay, and without that food source, that's wiping out their traditional way of life. Okay, and so through that being weakened, they're going to be forced onto reservations. Okay, and so they resort to trying to revive their traditional culture in hopes that one day they could bring back their traditional way of life and they can live that way once again. They participate in ceremonies known as the ghost dance, and the ghost dance had to do with this belief that eventually all of the settlers, all of the Americans would just disappear from the land, right? And the old ways would return, the buffalo would return, and basically the traditional way of life would return. And that was all related to the ghost dance, right? The ghost dance was where it was a specific dance that was done for a long period of time. The dancers would eventually lose consciousness and experience visions. And it's through those visions that they believed that time would come about and the traditional way of life would return. Okay, but the ghost dance ended in violence in the late 1800s when the U.S. federal government, when soldiers, actually the federal army, attacked a group of ghost dancers at Wounded Knee, killing about 300 men, but mostly women, children, and the elderly. Right, it was a peaceful group, and they were attacked by the army and were massacred. Okay, after that, the resistance, while there still was some resistance, like the violent battles, such as the Battle of Little Bighorn, had come to an end. All right, in 1871, the United States government decided to stop making treaties with Native American tribes. That was pretty much their policy, right? In order to take land from Native Americans or get land from Native Americans, they would sign treaties with them. That was how they justified the taking of land, right? They would get tribes to agree to living on reservations, and then the United States would get access to huge amounts of land. But in 1871, the federal government decided to stop making treaties with tribes because once they made treaties with tribes, those tribes were recognized as sovereign nations, okay? Sovereign nations who had the right to govern themselves, right? And so that was a problem because as the railroads are beginning to expand into the West, they understand that it's difficult to make agreements with these sovereign nations, with these tribes, right? Because they want to run the railroad through the tribal lands, and the tribes have sovereign right over the reservations, and they can disagree and decide to not allow the railroads to get to run through those lands. Okay, and so the railroad companies lobbied the federal government to stop the treaty system. Okay, and then in 1887, we have a very important act. It's known as the Dawes Act. And this act is aimed towards forcing Native Americans to assimilate into US culture, right, or American culture. So the way the Dawes Act worked was the government would send out land surveyors, okay, and they would survey the land on a reservation. And they would divide the land into plots of 160 acres, okay? And these 160-acre plots would be distributed to individual Native American families on that reservation. And once all of those plots had been given to various different families, whatever was left over, which could be huge amounts of land, would then be sold to American settlers at auction. It'd be auctioned off. Okay, so you see, this Dawes Act has a couple of different motives. I said assimilation, right? Assimilation to U.S. culture. Well, let me go into that first. So assimilation to U.S. culture, basically, that's going to be accomplished because now the government is dividing the Native American lands into these family plots, right? Where individual families are owning their own plots. And the idea is that the tribes will become farmers, right? If the tribe wasn't like a farming tribe, if they were, hunters, warriors, this would be a completely different way of life for them, okay? Now, not all tribes were nomadic and not all tribes were, just hunters. There were tribes who practiced agriculture before the arrival of Europeans, just so you know that. But there were a number of tribes, particularly in the plains area, which were hunters, okay? And so this is a completely different way of life for them to become farmers on these, 160-acre plots. That's a total change, okay? And so that's what I mean when I'm talking about the government trying to make tribes assimilate to the American lifestyle, which involves farming, being agriculturalists. All right, and it also involves gender roles, different gender roles, because now it's like the man who's expected to be doing the farming, and the woman's just in the household taking care of the house. That's total different gender roles for Native Americans, right? And the Dawes Act is trying to enforce that on Native Americans or influence their culture. Okay, and having individual plots is another change, because usually tribal land is owned by the whole tribe, not just individual families. Individual families may have the rights to use certain parts of the land, but it's not owned by them, right? They have the right to use it, but it's not owned. So a distinction there. So it's another change in Native American culture that the Dawes Act is trying to impress upon Native Americans. Okay, but then the other thing that the Dawes Act is accomplishing is the taking of Native American land. You see, as I explained earlier, any land that was left over after the 160-acre plots were distributed was sold off, auctioned off to American settlers. So now all of a sudden we have American settlers living on the reservation, owning land on the reservations. And so that's going to make the reservations take up this kind of checkerboard nature, where some lands are owned by Native Americans and some lands are owned by white settlers. All right, and so it's going to be, in a sense, kind of weakening the sovereignty of Native American tribes.